Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Kara-Leah, and I have been contemplating spiritual materialism and where I see that playing out in our consciousness festivals, in the spiritual community, the spiritual scene as such. And I've also been contemplating, how do you safeguard against that? And so I wanted to share some of those thoughts with you today. But before we go into that, let's look at some definitions. Like, what is spiritual materialism? Spiritual materialism is when people are using the practices and the teachings of spirituality in order to aggrandize the false self. And what that means is they're using the practices, using the teachings, or using being a teacher as a way to prop up. I don't like to use the word ego for various reasons, but it's like propping up the false sense of self, propping up the apparent individual self, accruing power, accruing influence. And it's common, it's really, really common that this happens. So spiritual materialism is using the practices of spirituality to further ingrain, in a way, the false self. Whereas spirituality is meant to be, or the purpose of spirituality is to move towards awakening and liberation. And awakening is awakening from the sense of a false self, the sense of a small sense of self, the story of me. And what unfolds with awakening is a sense of literally waking up, realizing that one is nothing more than awareness, nothing more than consciousness, nothing more than, nothing less than what's called essence nature or Shiva nature in the Tantric traditions. And so this is what's really interesting, is that spirituality, the use of spiritual paths and spiritual practices, and even the act of being a spiritual teacher, can go either way. It can liberate someone and awaken them to that which they are, or it can further take them further into bondage and into deeper and deeper false self stuff, right? So it can go either way. So that's what spiritual materialism is. Now, what safeguards against that? And this is where I got really curious. I'm like, well, how do we safeguard against that? And I realized that, within Tantra, there is this inbuilt practice which safeguards against spiritual materialism. But before I get to that, I want to talk about the 3 impure or ineffective motives for stepping onto the spiritual path, because this is super relevant. And I'm drawing heavily on the work here of Christopher Wallace, so I will link, depending on where this video goes, I'll put links up to some of his work around this. So that's my major source of research. So the 3 impure motives. When we come to the spiritual path, all of us start with one or more of these impure motives. And the first impure motive is, and I'm reading directly from Christopher's work right now, holding a vision of yourself as broken, damaged, or sinful, and doing yoga, spiritual practices, in order to fix yourself, in order to fix or heal yourself, to make yourself better. Right? And most people, when they come to the spiritual path, that's what they're doing. They're like, I'm fucked up, I need healing, I got to do this thing. And the reason that this is an ineffective motive is that it holds an inaccurate view of reality at its base, at its foundation. Because, right, going back to what I said before around awakening to your true self, or essence nature, or the aggrandization of the false self, trying to make this really simple and clear for you all. I could speak on this for a whole day, and I want to do it in 15 minutes. So that part of you, which is truly what you are, awareness, essence nature, consciousness, it is untouchable. It is always perfect. It is always healed. And whilst you, the person and the personality and the psyche might have experienced all kinds of traumas, etc., that which you truly are doesn't need fixing or healing. And this is critical, because if you believe that you need fixing or healing, you fundamentally believe that there is something wrong with you. And if you fundamentally believe that there's something wrong with you, you're holding a wrong view of reality. And so that wrong view of reality will prevent the spiritual practice from actually working and prevent you from awakening to your true nature. All right, that's a little summary, okay? And so the reason that motive is impure is it doesn't allow you to attain the goal, which is waking up or liberation, okay? So going on to the second one, right? Second impure motive. This is practicing yoga or any spiritual discipline in order to feel good, to get high, or to attain altered states of consciousness, right? And I see this a lot at consciousness festivals, right? People are doing the thing to feel good, to get high, and like, yeah, altered states of consciousness, woo, let's go, let's go, let's go. Now, inherently, this is not necessarily a bad thing, you know, like, great, feel good, we want to feel good, we want to feel high, you know, altered states of consciousness through spiritual practice, whatever. The danger arises that if this is the motive, right, if this is the motive to practice, the motive to practice is to feel good, the motive to practice is to get high, the motive for practice is to attain an altered state of consciousness, this becomes problematic because inherently as human beings, we are going to come up against uncomfortable feelings, painful feelings, challenging feelings. And if we're orientated to feeling good, to feeling high, to feeling better, we will ignore, deny, suppress, repress, push away all of that icky stuff. And that means that we are not orientating to what is true, right? So that orientation to feeling good, feeling high becomes an avoidance of truth. And that is a huge problem in the spiritual community. When people are afraid of the truth, when they avoid the truth. Then the truth is simply what is real, what is happening before we ever thought about it. It is the felt direct experience of reality before words, okay? All right, so that's the second impure motive, using yoga to get high. Let's just summarize it by saying that, okay? Now, number 3 is less common and very important still. So that the impure motive number 3 is practicing yoga in order to gain power over others, win friends, and influence people, or bolster the ego by receiving recognition and admiration. And this one will often apply more so to yoga teachers. For example, Bikram, great example of someone who was motivated by that impure motive number 3. You know, used Bikram and the practice of Bikram, which had benefits as a practice, but he used that to gain power over others, to win friends and influence people, to bolster the ego through receiving recognition and admiration. And this is incredibly problematic as well, because if that's the alignment, right, again, there's a avoidance of truth, right? Because then the yoga actually becomes the way of, like, going back to spiritual materialism. Spiritual materialism, materialism itself is about using your job, using your status, using your partner, using whatever's around you, using your children even in order to gain power, gain status, gain influence, gain friends, you see. And so going into yoga, and it's entirely possible to use yoga, the practice of yoga, the teaching of yoga, etc., to achieve the same ends, right? Which is ultimately about bolstering the false self. And all that power that's accruing through doing this, all of that power is then funneled not through awareness, right? And awareness by its very nature is operating for the benefit of all beings, because it's fucking awareness, it's loving awareness. No, all of that power and influence and etc., that is being gathered and gathered and gathered is being filtered through the false self. It's being filtered through the small self. And that means that all the wounds that false self still carries, and all of the patterning and all of the stuff, is where the power goes through. And that, when it's filtered through the false self, right, the false self will always seek to protect itself and to hold on to power, rather than to orientate to truth, for example. So how do we mitigate against this? This is what I was feeling into. Is like, what's the mitigation? And I know for myself, when I started practicing yoga, I was definitely practicing yoga to feel better. I was definitely practicing yoga to fix myself. I came in with a damaged spine, and I was walking with a limp and all of this stuff. And I didn't feel great about myself. And so that was definitely motivation for me in the first, decade or more of practice. It began to shift for me in 2010. And so, keeping this short, how do you mitigate? You use a prayer for pure motive, right? And this prayer for pure motive, again, this was given to me by Christopher Wallace, okay? And the prayer for pure motive is just this. You just say, every time you practice, may I practice out of love for myself. Because when you practice out of love for yourself, you're loving what is. You're loving the broken, damaged, whatever traumatized part. You just love it all. Just love it all. Recognizing that ultimately that which you are, awareness, is whole. May I practice out of love for myself. So that mitigates impure motive number 1. May I practice out of a desire to know the truth. And this mitigates impure motive number 2, which is the one where we want to get high and feel better and trip out on all the altered states of consciousness, etc. And so by praying, in essence, may I practice out of a desire to know the truth. That mitigates that. So it's not saying you won't feel better, you will, and you will experience highness. Bliss unfolds all the time. And so does other things as well. It's all welcomed. It is all welcomed. I welcome the truth of my experience. So that second part mitigates impure motive number 2. And then this is freaking critical, especially for people that are leading our communities. May I practice out of a desire. Desire to know the truth. May I practice for the well-being of all beings. May I practice for the well-being of all beings. May I lead for the well-being of all beings. Right? May I act for the well-being of all beings. And this mitigates impure motive number 3, which is about gaining power over others, winning friends, influencing people, and bolstering the ego in order to gain recognition and admiration. Right? And so when that is happening, that person will not care for others, right? Because they are orientated towards powering up the false self. When you mitigate it, may I practice for the well-being of all beings. That mitigates it completely. And that sets the orientation, you see. And so the prayer for pure motive, let me do the whole thing. May I practice out of love for myself. May I practice out of a desire to know the truth. And may I practice for the well-being of all beings. When you say that every single day, every time you practice, before and after practice, it begins to have an extraordinary impact on your practice. It makes it so much more effective and powerful. And it also becomes a safeguard against spiritual materialism. It becomes a safeguard against accruing power that is then used to aggrandize the false self and used in a way that is not necessarily beneficial for the well-being of all beings. And so that is how I orientate now. As a teacher, it's absolutely critical, because what I've noticed is that the amount of practice I've been doing and the dedication to the path is power is starting to accrue. And the question I ask myself is like, shit, how do I stay safe in this situation? How do I allow power to be there, but trust that that I'm not gonna misuse it? That's the question I was asking myself. And that's when I came across this Pure Motive by Christopher Wallace. And so if you are dedicated to the spiritual path, if you are genuinely interested in awakening and liberation, if you are interested in knowing yourself as awareness, liberating yourself from conditioning, and just stepping into like the freedom, the joy, the playfulness that arises out of that, then what I suggest is use this prayer for pure motive. And what I'd also suggest is start to be discerning about the teachers that you work with and the communities that you step into, and about the leaders of the communities around you. Because it is entirely possible for people to look like they're very spiritual and they're not. And it is entirely possible for people to look like they're very spiritual and they're actually preying upon the people that they appear to be serving and or teaching or engaging with. So use discernment. Really pay attention and see, is this person orientating to love for themselves? Because if you're not yet like madly, deeply in love with yourself, then it gets challenging to interact with other people and to pour that love out. Because if self-hatred's operating internally, then that self-hatred will often be vented externally under situations of pressure, right? So watch the people in the community, watch the leaders, watch the teachers, and just see, right? Are they operating out of love for themselves? Are they operating out of a desire to know the truth? When people bring things up, how do they respond? Are they interested in the truth, or are they interested in protecting and defending themselves? And ask yourself, are they operating for the well-being of all beings? For the well-being of all beings. So there you go, spiritual materialism, a real danger, of course, it always has been, and it's okay that it's there. It's just a thing. It's just an obstacle. Hey, there it is. And let's get past it. Use the prayer for pure motive. Alrighty, I just went over my 15-minute mark. Instagram might not let me on anymore. I might have to delete some stuff. Sending love to you all. My name's Kara-Leah. You guys know where to find me.